Yeah, very brief overview of what we've done so far. So this is the third meeting in the RL debates. The first one, Eli Senesh talked about value function and why it should be abolished. And what I remember kind of as a highlight of that meeting is that Eli suggested we should not think about accumulating rewards, but rather maybe minimizing divergences between distributions. That's more adaptive, that's more general. And it nicely dovetails with what Fritz talked about. And he talks about minimizing the divergence between some true distribution of reality and the agent's model of it. And that divergence happens to be the KL divergence. So I think that was a nice kind of overlap between these two talks. And then next up today, we're going to hear from Niels about the 1,000 brains idea. And then, of course, the other meetings are scheduled like this. So you can always go to this link and check out the schedule. Okay, that's all I had to say. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I believe Will is going to now talk about 1,000 brain projects. Okay, can you share? I don't know if you have a question.
I will send a request. Request has been sent.
Oh. I think.
How did you get to do it?
I think I accidentally declined, so I'll just make you co-host.
Okay. All right. Should be looking at my screen. Okay, so this is just a quick overview of the 1,000 Brains project. Should be like 2 minutes at max. And so I want to summarize 25 years of research in the next 30 seconds or so. Niels is going to go into a lot more detail. I am not going to. But essentially, Jeff, 25 years ago, decided that he should try and reverse engineer the neocortex as the most probable likely way of getting to human level intelligence. And so while Numento was not doing wet work, we were taking papers and analyzing those and trying to come up with a general theory of what all the connections in the neocortex are doing, what the thalamus does, and so on and so forth. We've kind of distilled this down into kind of 3 core principles of modularity, sensorimotor learning and inference, and reference frames. And again, Niels is going to talk about these, but essentially modularity is the 1,000 brains idea, is that kind of your neocortex is 150,000 mini sensorimotor learning and inference systems, about the size of a grain of rice. They're all interconnected. They vote together. They're stacked in a hierarchy and a heterarchy. And all of these things are learning complete models of objects in the world. And all of these are based in reference frames. So each object that each of these grains of rice is learning is based in its own reference frame, which has interesting properties like being path integratable and so on. In the last 5 years, we're building a system based on those principles called Monty, which is named after Vernon Mountcastle, the guy who first proposed the idea that there's this repeating structure in the neocortex that might be a fundamental unit of computation of intelligence. And then this paper, which Niels again is going to talk about, the 1,000 brain system for sensorimotor intelligence for rapid, robust learning and inference, talks about kind of the state of Monty about 6 months ago, what it can currently do and comparisons to state-of-the-art transformer in terms of how much data you need to feed it. It's like 577 million times less flops required for Monty to run and do 90% correct inference. And then primarily what I wanted to talk about is that we're enthusiastic for any PhD or master students who want to get involved with Monty. If you're interested in basing part of your thesis or your thesis on Monty, there are a lot of opportunities in there. So one is that it is incredibly energy and data efficient. You don't need trillions of images in order to train Monty and get startling performance out of it. It's modular, meaning you can start with kind of one learning module and then stack those and do more interesting experiments as you go. We have an open source community behind it. We publish all our meetings on YouTube. We're completely open about all of the work we do. We have a discourse forum. We have a request for comments process if you want to change or modify or add to the Monty system. And the research team is active there and is helpful and gives feedback on that. There are also diverse kind of research opportunities. So our entire roadmap is public, and you can see all of the things that we think we need to build in order to get from where we currently are to human level intelligence. And all of these are open for researchers to get involved with and try out. The entire thing is open source. It's based on an MIT license. It's all in GitHub. And also we have this, over the last 20 years, Nementa has been building up a patent block, but we also have a non-assert pledge on those patents. And the reason we wanted to do that was so that this work will remain open to everyone forever. No one will ever be able to buy these patents and start enforcing them. And so all of the work here will remain open for humanity for infinity, we hope. And so if you're interested, you can go to thousandbrains.org or contact us on any one of our socials, Twitter, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, Discourse, so on and so forth. And that's it for me. I'll hand it over to Niels.
Thanks, Will. Let me see if I can make Niels as well. Okay, you should be.
Oh yeah, nice. Yeah, that works. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks very much, and yeah, thanks for starting us off, Will. And I think it was on your slide just to mention as well about the kind of computational efficiency that you can run Monty on CPUs. If you don't have a graphics card or a access to a server to run expensive deep learning experiments, this might again be something interesting for you. So my name's Niels. I'm the lead of the research team at the Thousand Brains project, and I'm excited to be talking to you today about basically how we think learning might take place in the neocortex, this Thousand Brains theory, and how we're currently working on building a system that takes these principles and turns it into something practical, something you can actually use. And with that, so I think Hattie, firstly, thanks for organizing this debate series. I think it's a great idea. And I think one of the things you kind of wanted was for us to kind of put our foot out there with maybe a spicy take or, try and sort of pick a corner. So I'm opening with these claims. The first of which is that learning in sensorimotor settings typically overemphasizes a requirement for rewards. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a bit. And the other is that existing systems for unsupervised sensory motor learning, so in the absence of rewards or with limited rewards, that these have significant challenges. This includes deep learning, and it relates to everything from poor sample efficiency to poor generalization, and so on. And I'll also be talking more about that. So the aim for today is really to kind of give a bit of background of where this Thousand Brains theory that Will was already starting to talk about comes from. And kind of framing it as, why we have this kind of position that we do, I guess, in this debate. And then touching on some limitations of current approaches. And then I'll go into some of the details about how Thousand Brain systems work, what the architecture is. And then finally, some, promising, if early, results on how Monty works. And, hopefully you'll come away from this thinking, this is a really interesting approach that either you want to get involved with or learn more about. So the Thousand Brains theory, as was kind of touched on, is this proposal for what the neocortex is doing, this mammalian structure in the brain, huge volume of our brain, and kind of widely seen as the sort of seat of intelligence. And in particular, what the kind of potential subunit of the neocortex, these cortical columns, what that kind of algorithm that they are implementing might be. And so to kind of start things off, I just thought I'd kind of highlight some observations or kind of maybe also some takes that relate to this whole question that you kind of started with, Hattie, with these debates. How do we learn in sensory motor settings, and what is the role of reinforcement learning? But so I think the first one is that mammals can learn structured representations very quickly and without explicit rewards. And this is something that I think came up in an earlier talk, but this is for anyone who's not familiar with it, a classic result in this kind of area from Tolman, where he had these rats exploring a maze with these blind alleys. And then depending on what condition the rats were in, when they got to this area here, they either received food or they would be removed from the box. And basically, they were looking at how much time did they spend in these kind of blind alleys as they were going round. And there was three groups. One never received an explicit reward, so in the form of food. And so so this is the kind of error, which as I said is like how often they were going into those blind alleys. As a function of the days of experiments and time they spent in the maze, that gradually decreased. So they seemed kind of less and less interested in those blind alleys. And then another kind of more standard group was the one that got a reward from the beginning. And so you can see that they improve more quickly. They go straight for that kind of reward. But the really interesting one was this group that got the food on day 11, where they had this dramatic improvement in their ability to kind of home out and find this reward. And so this suggested that they were learning this kind of latent representation of the environment and that exploration wasn't totally kind of meaningless or without value, but that actually going into those blind alleys, they were learning the structure of what they're seeing. But I would argue we learn structured knowledge for much more than just 2D environments, and that this is kind of a hallmark of intelligence. Really, is that everything from something you can hold in your hand. So these are drawings of cups by both children and adults, or a cat, or a house, or whatever it may be. We understand this as a structured object, and what I mean by structured is there's a sense of space and of relations between things in that space. And that's how we understand that is what that object is. And also that's how we understand how we can interact with that object. If you want to touch a cat's ear, you know where to move to because of your understanding of the animal. And in contrast, we don't just key off of textures or other kind of high frequency features that might correlate with objects. And there's at least a degree to which, for example, deep learning systems have a tendency to do that, where they kind of overemphasize things like texture in classification, resulting in kind of missing the more global shape of objects. But it's also, not just things you can hold in your hand and not just environments. It goes all the way up to abstract spaces like family trees or mathematics. There's a huge kind of diversity of what we can learn structured representations for. I feel I should say, please feel free to stop me and interrupt if you have any questions. I think, as you said, Hadi, there'll be a Q&A at the end. So I guess if it's anything particularly controversial, feel free to leave it until then. But also very happy to take questions as we go.
There's a question.
So as you offer to ask questions, when you were talking about the cortical columns, because I've been familiar with the Thousand Brains project, but I'm not familiar with the details of what you guys have been doing. But something that comes to mind when you're talking about these cortical columns and them being almost these sort of like fundamental units, does that assume a certain level of like homogeneity in those columns? Because I mean, even throughout cortex, even across like the ventral stream or in different regions, or even within a different region, like the canonical microcircuits that you see at play are extremely different and even evolve across certain axes.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question. I think the main thing is that the kind of broad strokes are there. So I guess you have things like agranular cortex and things like that, or more specialized regions like extra layers in V1 and L4 and things like that. But I think the proposal really is just that as long as the kind of broad strokes are there in terms of certain layers and things like that, then we might expect different levels of cellular density and things like that in different regions.
Or even like receptor density, different cell types, like picking up, dropping down. Okay.
Right. And I mean, I think there's a lot of that complexity that the Thousand Brains theory doesn't try to explain at this point. And maybe that will I don't know, become clear in the future, just take the sheer complexity of inhibitory neurons and the different kind of receptors and things like that. Not all of that detail is something that, it gets into. And I think it's a constant challenge, I guess, to try and decide, what is the level of detail that's important to focus on and what is maybe just kind of a quirk of evolution and the kind of complexity of biology.
So is there a world where like down the line, you guys would then consider that like, I mean, imagine like that increased biology of the fact that, okay, once we've established sort of these like canonical cortical units, what changes and how could you even get changes across certain, the word I use is axis, but more just because some of those have actually been observed.
Right. Yeah. So I guess in general, the kind of main aim of the TBP is to to kind of reverse engineer what is kind of sufficient to create a useful sensory motor system. So you'll definitely see in kind of the model that I'm describing later, kind of simplifications and assumptions in terms of biology. So yeah, we're not spending a lot of time trying to then map it back onto, for example, experimental findings, whether those are behavioral or neurophysiology. But for sure, we are interested in collaborating with that kind of anyone interested in that kind of thing. So yeah, and I'll maybe talk a bit later about some of the early collaborations that we're starting right now. But yeah, thanks for the questions. So the second then kind of observation is that essentially, I'm going to argue essentially all the learning in the above requires some amount of sensory motor exploration. Almost by definition, if it's a structured representation, if there's a sense of space, then you need to kind of move through that space in order to learn. And so again, I think this came up in one of the earlier talks. This is a classic experiment from the 60s where these two, it's also kind of sad, but these two kittens were put in this apparatus where one of them was actively moving. They could both see. One of them was actively moving, which was causing the other kitten to move. And then their visual perception was studied. And essentially only the cat that was moving actively and kind of understood how it was moving through the world was able to develop normal vision. But I think it's not surprising that movement is paramount to most kind of biological perception and intelligence, because the reality is we only sample a fraction of the world at any given moment. So if you look at, for example, the fovea, we have this illusion of this high resolution vision everywhere, but the reality is that the high acuity vision we get from the fovea is only around 1 degree, which is equivalent to holding your kind of fingernail or your pad of your finger at arm's length. And so it's no surprise that we're moving our eyes constantly, multiple times every second. And this doesn't just apply to vision. So if you have sensory motor learning as well, you have this is what you call an example from Gibson's book in the 60s, which we kind of set up a similar experimental paradigm. This is Will at one point. But essentially, he gave these 10 objects to adults, and they were allowed to feel it with their fingers. They never saw them. And within about an hour, they were able to distinguish them perfectly. And I want to emphasize, within an hour, that's incredibly fast. It wasn't like they slept. It wasn't like they needed some sleep-wake algorithm to be able to develop representations or anything like that. And so something is going on that enables us to learn very quickly as we move over objects. And he also noticed that, yeah, it was very much, that's how people learn them, was touching them with their fingers, moving their fingers. But yeah, this is where we once tried testing our inference abilities with this, where we had one finger pad that we were allowed to move over an object. And Will is actually really good at this. He got the back kind of panel of a remote control in like 10 seconds or something crazy. And it could have been literally any object. So yeah, I think we were a bit scared of Will after seeing that, but it's pretty impressive. And then, there's other examples as well in rodents, but also, for example, here in sea lions and seals, they have whiskers and they move these. It's called whisking, and that's key to how they understand the environment around them and detect objects. And then the one that's more of a kind of a claim, that it's maybe more of an open question then, is that a common cortical algorithm or circuit might underlie 1 and 2. And so, clearly the hippocampus and hippocampal complex is also involved in learning, particularly when we need to learn things very quickly and in environments and things like that. But if you believe that the cortex is developing structured representations, that, it's not just if there's models essentially and not just the kind of a huge model-free system, then somehow those structures are developing in cortex. And as I'll discuss in a moment, there's evidence that there's some sort of kind of canonical circuit. And you may have come across this before, but this comes from Mountcastle, who studied the response properties of various animals to stimuli. So this is, for example, where he was looking at the paws of a cat. And I believe, yeah, this was actually a study from Ferraro, but they would basically, this is the cortical sheet, and they would put these probes in, and kind of normal to the surface. And then you would see that if you kind of stimulated a particular area of the paw, all of the neurons in that kind of area had these overlapping receptive fields. So that's what's shown with these little circles. And if you kind of moved slightly along, you might see different sensitivities to the particular kind of features that these neurons respond to. Oh yeah, go ahead, Eli.
So to ask a clarifying question, what they found is that whole cortical columns will respond together.
Yeah, so as in whole cortical columns. So it was more that if you no, so it wasn't like necessarily all the neurons light up all at once. It was more that if you kind of touch in this area and you look at a particular and you kind of move where you are stimulating, one neuron say will let's say here will respond to any stimulation of a particular kind in that region, and then another one maybe responds in a smaller area, but that there was general overlap as long as they were within a certain region of the kind of cortical surface.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. And then, but then if you, rather than going normal to the kind of surface, if you go slightly kind of off angle, what he noticed was that there was this discrete jump in the receptive field properties where, or kind of area, where suddenly the neurons here were responding to what seemed to be almost like a discrete separate patch of skin. And alongside this, kind of similar observations were made, for example, in cat visual cortex by Huppel and Wiesel. This is them looking at the response properties of sets of neurons, different eccentricities. And you see, again, this kind of overlap of clustered neurons in their receptive fields, but then neurons that are kind of really close together. So the argument goes kind of within a column, they might respond to different orientations of bars. And so you have kind of like a set of neurons that respond to different orientations, but they are all kind of covering the same receptive field. And then the kind of third example is in rodents, their somatosensory cortex associated with their whiskers is what's called barrel cortex, because under histological staining, you develop these very classical kind of round, it's called cylindrical structures. And each one of these barrels is associated with an individual whisker. And that's a very kind of distinct finding that any stimulation along that whisker will basically activate some set of neurons within that barrel. So that kind of suggests maybe there's this sort of circumscribed, almost discrete structure as you kind of move along the surface of the cortex. But then at the same time, you have, if you look at a kind of slice down the cortex, you have these stereotyped layers, which there was kind of discussion of earlier, where the kind of patterns can differ. You can have different thicknesses. Some parts of cortex may kind of lack a certain layer, but in general, this pattern persists throughout the cortex, and everything from primary sensory cortex up to higher cortical regions. And what's interesting is not only do you see this pattern of particular cell types, but they also have this stereotype connectivity. And of course, there's always an exception in neuroscience, but in general, there's these pretty strong patterns of how these different layers connect with one another. For example, with layer 4, receiving sensory input via the thalamus, connecting to L3, and then that projecting information forward. This is just showing a small subset of these connections. But another kind of interesting one maybe to highlight is that all of these cortical columns will, kind of regardless of where one looks, seem to project directly to motor regions from layer 5. So it's this kind of interesting architecture there that that one wants to understand. And Mountcastle's proposal was basically that this cortical column is the key functional unit in the neocortex, and that all of them are performing some fundamentally kind of common computation, and that they would operate in parallel as these sort of semi-independent units. And so if we bring it back to kind of this debate and reinforcement learning, I guess the kind of position I'm trying to push for is that even if there is an intrinsic reward like curiosity or information gain or something like that, which I think makes sense if there is, clearly that has some value. But I think it still leaves open the question of how do we actually learn so quickly, given the ability to just through a few movements develop kind of useful representations. And how do we develop these in a way that is structured and so enables us to generalize? And so this is where the kind of inductive biases, the key principles of the thousand brains theory come in. And so the first one is sensorimotor learning. And what I mean by that is movement is essential. So essentially, if the system isn't moving, then no learning is going to be taking place because it's not just a simple input-output mapping. That's model free. That's something that subcortical structures can do. Associating a smell with some aversity or something like that. It's much more about learning a structured representation, and so movement is essential. The other is that it's going to be using some sort of modular computational unit. In the case of the brain, that's proposal is that is a cortical column. And then something that kind of goes beyond Mountcastle's description is the kind of suggestion that each cortical column is using a reference frame to essentially lay down these representations and structure them. And so this is a, if you will, a coordinate system that a kind of a space that is object-centric, that's internal to that column, that it can then lay down information and lay down that information using local learning rules. So simple associative Hebbian learning. And then if I kind of take a step back, then to look at kind of sensorimotor learning today, I would say maybe unsurprisingly, but there is a huge emphasis on backpropagation or deep learning based methods. And this applies, even if it is more kind of model based, like the recent Dreamer architectures. And then maybe another major camp is more kind of probabilistic Bayesian approaches, which have a lot of theoretical appeal and can be valuable in research, but can face challenges as well when being applied as a practical system in the real world. And in terms of backpropagation of error, I would argue that it's unlikely to be the main form of learning the brain or really exist there at all. So there's significant issues around biological plausibility that maybe many people here are aware of, where backprop requires you to have global information, non-local information about the state of the network in order to update the weights in the kind of the way that the algorithm requires, which then has led to attempts to make it more biologically plausible, for example, through predictive coding and things like that. But I think one issue is as soon as you bring in more biological plausibility, it becomes less performant. So whether it's weight sparsity or the data is streaming input, or you're using a formulation like predictive coding, in general, these networks perform significantly worse than kind of more state-of-the-art pure deep learning method might. And this is concerning because even a kind of deep learning network that has superhuman backpropagation of error, the kind of numerical precision and access to global information that could not exist in the brain or any biological system, it has all kinds of issues from sample inefficiency to these kind of brittle alien representations. There's many examples of this, everything from adversarial examples to being highly sensitive to rotations, to classifying more on texture than shape, as I was talking about before. I'm sure we've all seen the generative models with six-fingered hands, or the kind of absence of object permanence in these systems. And of course, as you scale up the data and add in certain loss functions and things like that, you can kind of by degrees try and reduce these things. But none of these changes have fundamentally removed these issues from deep learning. And this, I should say, this isn't a dunk on deep learning. I think it's a very powerful technology and clearly has very important uses. I think AlphaFold is a great example of that. It's a universal function approximator. That's an amazing technology to have access to. But as a way for systems to be to learn through sensorimotor interactions with the world and learned structured representations, I think it's not a great candidate. And yeah, there's other issues. There's catastrophic forgetting, huge issue for sensorimotor systems, and just generally poor out of distribution generalization. I think there was hope maybe 10 years ago that deep reinforcement learning systems trained on Atari games would be able to then kind of play other games in some kind of intelligent way, but that hasn't manifested.
Just a quick comment there is that there's a really interesting paper that if you take RL systems trained on Atari and make the game simpler, even then they don't generalize. Just any distribution shift, even if you make it simpler. So it's like a
interesting. Yeah, I'm not aware of that one, but yeah, that sounds interesting. I might try and grab that.
I'll try to
later.
Find it and paste it somewhere. Yeah. Go ahead.
I remember there was one where they, I don't think it was actually a paper. It was more kind of a blog experiment, but where they took some Atari games and they changed every cell to be a totally random kind of color. And the player token would kind of change and all this kind of stuff. It was totally crazy and no human could ever learn to play it. But the reinforcement learning agent basically got the exact same performance. So it was like in that, of course, on that exact, if it was trained on that one. But so just that kind of ability to fit arbitrary functions, like that is superhuman. People can't, take a DNA sequence and predict an arbitrary protein structure. So it's in many ways it's superhuman, but obviously in many other ways it has all these issues. And then in terms of things like active inference and the free energy principle, I think at a high level, these seem like reasonable proposals, and the idea that the brain is trying to reduce surprise and trying to kind of gather information to reduce uncertainty about the outside world. I think that makes a lot of sense and is consistent, I would say, with the Thousand Brains theory and the kind of models that we're currently building. But in terms of kind of at least our motivation of actually building a system that can kind of interact in the real world, it's often challenging if you kind of try and adhere strongly to the kind of more formal approaches, everything from the dimensionality to kind of assumptions about Gaussian noise and so forth. And that often then leads back to deep learning as a way of parameterizing these kinds of systems in order for them to actually work in a more kind of complex setting. But then by going back to deep learning, it introduces all the issues I was just discussing. So our view then is we want something that's neuron-like. So it's, has something that, it accumulates information. There's kind of a point that is kind of representing something. But it's also going to be, non-parametric. So able to kind of represent complex distributions. And then lastly, something that uses local learning rules. So no backpropagation is allowed. And so that's where then I will start talking about the Thousand Brains theory. And so this is a broad topic. I'd love to have more time. Maybe if people are interested, we can come back some other time and I can go more into a technical dive now that there's a bit of kind of background. But the Thousand Brains theory originally started at, well, it's always been about kind of engineering systems, but maybe earlier versions were more closely adhered to the kind of details of the neuroscience. So for example, proposing a kind of alternative neuron model that's kind of a balance between a point neuron and a multi-compartmental neuron that still has things like dendritic integration, and making suggestions about what these layers in the cortex might be doing, such as that, for example, layer 6 might be where this kind of reference frame exists, and maybe there's something like grid cells or something similar that is helping ground these representations. And then implementing models that actually kind of test these theories in, for example, with synthetic data. And so, for example, this was a system that could kind of learn a structured representation of kind of oriented features in a synthetic task. But the kind of key principles that underlie the Thousand Brains theory are these four ones here that have been alluded to a few times now. So sensorimotor learning, this modular unit, the explicit reference frames, and using local associative learning rules. And so then the Thousand Brains system is our effort at the TVP to then actually implement a practical system based on that. And so there's a code base that if you're interested, you could go download after this talk and play around with the system called tpp.monty. And this is essentially an agent, a system that moves in a simulated environment, interacts with objects, and can learn about them and infer on them.
So I don't know how much technical details are you planning to get into, but out of these 4 items, I think the only one that I don't understand is what do you mean by explicit reference frames?
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely get into that. Yeah. And yeah, I think this was already mentioned. We named if I talk about Monty, that's how we kind of generally refer to the AI system itself. Sorry, my headphones are just dropping battery.
Can you guys still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, if I refer to Monty, that's the kind of name we use generally to refer to the system. It's kind of the first example of a thousand brain system, and the one that we kind of evaluate. And just to kind of maybe give a bit of concrete grounding when I'm talking about Monty kind of moving and learning and things like that, most of the experiments we've done are in an embodied simulator, specifically something called Habitat, with 3D objects from this YCB dataset, which is a dataset of 77 household objects. And so going through these kind of key components in series. So it's a sensory motor system. So naturally there are sensors. And so what we have with Monty is what we call a sensor module. And this is the component that will take in raw sensory data and output it in a format that can then be passed into kind of the hierarchy into the system. And one thing to kind of highlight is this sensory patch is very narrow. Generally, we intentionally keep this constrained to kind of force us to emulate what the columns seem to be doing, where they are just kind of looking at a particular patch of the world, but then moving over that world. And so that's what you're seeing as kind of a preview here on the right. This is just to kind of orient you in space in terms of where the sensor is at any given time. So you can imagine this is quite an impoverished input unless you are integrating your movement and building a representation that way. And so then the other kind of thing to highlight then with the sensor module is it outputs this information. Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
Sorry, maybe you're gonna get into this, but I'm just a little confused. So because you're talking about like some sensory, it's like somatosensory from before, but now we're looking at like RGB like views. So what just to orient, like should I be thinking of this like as a model of like vision, or are you doing somatosensory?
The idea is right. The idea is it should apply to both, so that whether it's vision or somatosensory, that the same idea, the same kind of algorithm is running in a column, and therefore the same kind of principles will be working in Monty. And yeah, so
But
so
in
they
this
are
case, it's vision.
yeah. In this case, it's vision. And so it's yeah, RGB plus depth information that we're giving in. And yeah, it all gets a bit blurry, I guess, when it's kind of artificial systems. You'll see later we have kind of a finger-like agent as well. So this one moves more like an eye, it kind of saccades. We also have something that moves more like a finger, but because it's an artificial system, we can give it RGB. And in the same way with a robotic finger, you could attach a camera to it, because I guess cameras are much cheaper than in biology, or like eyes. But yeah, to kind of answer your question, the idea is it should apply to either. One thing maybe to highlight is there are sensory modalities that probably this doesn't kind of factor in. So say olfaction, it's not clear what would the movement be and things like that. But interestingly enough, the olfactory cortex is a more ancient kind of area that doesn't have that 6-layered structure. It doesn't pass information via the thalamus in the same way. So it actually fits that it's whatever it's doing is probably different. It's probably more model free. Maybe it's different in some animals like canines if they are kind of moving more as they smell and things like that. Maybe they're also kind of building structured representations. And then for something like audition, some of that movement might be happening less in the kind of agent space, but more in the external space. So you can imagine changes in pitch as kind of a form of movement. And then, some animals like bats and things like that, where they move their ears and their bodies much more actively as they listen. Again, they may rely more on kind of a structured representation of those sounds. But yeah, so then in terms of the output of the sensor module, so it's going to communicate a pose, which we define as a location and a local kind of orientation. So you can think about it here as the surface normal, the vector coming out of the surface of the patch, and the directions of principal curvature. So the direction of kind of deepest curvature and minimal curvature. This is going to be then the key kind of component of this feature that gets passed, or this kind of sensory signal that gets passed upwards, and then anything else like color or how curved it is, or anything else that you want to kind of append to that information, you can. But the key thing here really is this pose, and the analogy in kind of V1 of visual cortex might be an oriented bar. And so it's the orientation, the pose of that bar that is key to what is going to be integrated and kind of laid down. And then the other thing is, again, sensorimotor. So obviously Monty has to move. And so this is just showing an example here where you can imagine Monty as this kind of finger-like system where this is the tip of the finger, this is kind of the knuckle or the joint, and it's kind of moving along the handle until it decides, and I'll talk more about this later, that it would be more interesting to move over to the head of this fork, and so it kind of jumps over there. And this is what
there's a question. Yeah, before you
yeah.
continue, just to make the mapping a little bit more explicit, because I'm having a hard time going from the image patch to the pose.
Yeah.
That's not learned. What I'm understanding that that's not learned, and that's something you guys have learned.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, at least in this case, it's not learned. So for now, we kind of assume that there's some way of kind of extracting that, and in this case, we have access to depth information and things like that as well.
I see. And in the vision example here, one column then gets one pose. If we were to map that onto V1, right, getting input from thalamus with center surround, fields. What do I need to do to make this sound like, oh yeah, that's totally what layer 4 is getting, right? Is a pose, right?
So I say the question again.
Basically, there's a missing step in my mind from our kind of back model of layer 4, in V1 getting input from thalamus to being in pose, right? Can you help me?
So well, I guess it's the mixture of center surround and something like Gabor filters will give you a sensitivity to a particular orientation in space, and at least in the 2D case, that is the pose is kind of what is the sensitivity to a particular edge orientation.
Okay, so that in that case, I'd be like a pair of filters, like a quadrature pair, and I'd get I know what the orientation is because I know, like on top of this, I have to know what my filter is. I have to have a label for it.
Yeah, so that would be it in the kind of neuroscience more focused. That would be like a mini column would be sensitive to a particular orientation, and that's where kind of with Hubble and Weasel, when they kind of went down with the probe, as long as they stayed in a very narrow space, then all those cells seem to kind of respond to similar orientations.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so like one thing we might want to do at some point is make this a bit more flexible. Like it'd be very appealing if using center surround and kind of difference of Gaussians is enough to then get this without kind of using a certain mathematical library to calculate surface normals and things like that. So that's something that we might explore in the future, but at least as kind of a proof of concept, we basically provide that as part of the sensor module.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thanks for the question. And Eli.
Okay, so you had this figure where you're showing us sort of the gaze moving over this fork, and I was wondering, how is it moving?
Okay, yeah. As in, how is
Yes,
like
how,
what is deciding how it moves?
or yeah, and what sort of dynamics is it subject to that it controls in order to move?
Yeah. So it's the agent is this kind of yeah, in technically even the finger is as far as Habitat Simulator is concerned, it's a camera at a location that just maintains it tries to maintain a kind of fixed distance to the surface of the object. Um, as I'll kind of touch on later, there is kind of a model-free policy that, based on the kind of what it's seeing on the surface, it tries to kind of inch along in a particular direction while kind of staying along that surface. So as it gets kind of close to here, it can see that the surface is curving down. And so it's going to use that information in a model-free way, as in it doesn't have an explicit model of
Okay.
what object it's seeing, to then
So this
follow
is
that.
sort of, so this sort of assumes that movement is a solved problem, and then just says, I want to move here, I want to move here,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
sees
The
what
model
the
free
sensor
one
input is.
assumes, I guess, tries to handle it a bit more, but then the model based movement is very much exactly that. Where so when the system gets here, we have this kind of policy where it basically does like an internal mental rotation of the two most likely objects, and then it kind of understands, okay, this could be a knife, this could be a fork. The place to go to tell them apart would be here. And it basically just tells the motor system, I want to be there. And so, from a biological perspective, the analogy would be sending a signal to the subcortical systems to just say, I want to be here. You know, you figure out the walking, you figure out manipulating my arm or whatever it may be. And in Habitat, in the case of Monty, because it's a simulation, right now we literally just teleport the agent to that location, assuming it's not inside the object. Um, cool. Um, so yeah, and this is just showing some of these examples of the kind of movement that can happen, where this is a more kind of this is that distant agent that's more like an eye that's kind of doing these small saccades. We now have ways of using salients to do larger saccades, but not in this older model. Um, and then but it can also kind of move to these more interesting things like the rim or the handle. And then similarly, this is this kind of more finger-like agent, which uses the kind of curvature it's sensing to it kind of has a model-free bias essentially to find those interesting and therefore follow them. So then the kind of next key component is the modularity of this computational unit. And so this is what we call a learning module in Monty. And the idea is this kind of maps onto a cortical column. And I won't go into kind of detail about what kind of layers we think this might map onto. I'm happy to talk about that though if anyone has questions. But I'll try and get more into kind of what the learning module does and eventually get to, yeah, Hadi, the point you were asking about, you know, what are these reference frames actually? But so the learning module is going to receive that sensory information from a sensor module. It doesn't receive the raw sensory input. So again, from a kind of biological perspective, this is kind of post LGN that it gets this input. That is then going to be associated during learning with these reference frames. And during inference, that information is going to be used to update hypotheses about what is being observed. And then that information can either be kind of summarized or kind of integrated in a way that you kind of have an output from this column, and that's what would be passed up. So, you know, this column might conclude, okay, I'm looking at a mug, and this would also have a pose associated with it, but here it's the location and the orientation of the mug, not a kind of small sensory patch. And then finally, the learning module can also output a goal state, and that's kind of what I was talking about earlier to your question, Eli, about it's really a location in space that it kind of either wants to be sensing or it wants an object to be manifested there, whatever it is, it's kind of a location. And this is what in biology would correspond to the L5's projections of to kind of motor regions. And so it's important to point out that even as we scale up the architecture, either through multiple learning modules in a hierarchy or kind of laterally, all of them have a motor output. It's not just kind of, motor cortex, or it's not just the top of the hierarchy that has a motor output. And so then kind of bringing these modular components together, this is what a kind of architecture, or at least a relatively simpler architecture might look like, where you have different sensor modules. You can think of these as kind of different kind of LGN kind of components or kind of regions corresponding to different patches of the retina. They're both processing the sensory information that they're getting, corresponding to these small patches, and sending that to their corresponding learning modules. And then these learning modules, I said, can either pass information further up the hierarchy, or they can do something I won't have time to talk about today, but what we call voting. But essentially, it's a consensus forming algorithm that the learning modules can essentially kind of agree or disagree on what they might be seeing. And then in pink here is that motor output that goes to the motor system.
When you say learning modules, can you make it explicit? Like, do you have like adaptable parameters, and where are they? And how do you adapt them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really close to that. Okay, I promise. Okay. Yeah, no, thank you. It's a good question. Yeah, Will already talked about this. Why is it called 1,000 brains? Well, basically, each one of these learning modules, or in the brain, a cortical column, because it's both doing sensory processing, it's argued it's building models, and it has motor outputs. That in of itself is what you might classically call something like a brain. And so it's a fairly kind of it's fairly independent unit in terms of what it can do. And then, but that there's many of them. And then the kind of last detail at this level of the kind of diagram is the idea that this message that I've been talking about a few times, excuse me, the pose along with any other features, is what we call this cortical messaging protocol. And that basically constrains the nature of the information that's being passed between these modules, such that all of them adhere to this kind of protocol that they basically have this pose and then any other information you want. But basically it's kind of meaningless to pass information along if you don't have that pose. If you don't have some sense of kind of location or space, then it's a meaningless message. But before you get to the sensor modules, and after the output, the kind of final output of the motor system that, say flexes a muscle or whatever, or actuator, these don't adhere to this CMP. And from kind of a building a system point of view, one of the appealing aspects of this is that it makes it even easier to kind of expand it as a modular system. And, someone can come along and implement a custom sensor module for LiDAR data if they want, as long as it adheres in its output to this CMP. And in terms of what this kind of CMP message is, I said this a couple of times, but basically it's this pose, it's a location, and it's an orientation in a common reference frame, but it's a kind of local orientation in terms of if it's a sensor patch, it's that kind of surface normal in those principal curvature directions. This is just showing examples of what I was just saying, that different types of messages in different parts of the system can all be examples of this, including goal state sent to the motor system. And then this is just starting to kind of formalize it a bit more and also introduce some of the notation we use in the paper, where if you have a CMP message at time t, it's this set of items where we have a 3D location in a shared body-centric coordinate system. So one of the ideas is that when the kind of columns are communicating with one another and with either the motor system or the sensor modules, they have some coordinate system that they share. So in the brain, that could be allocentric in certain parts of the brain, relative to some landmark in the environment, or it could be egocentric. The main thing is it just needs to be common to all the columns. And then associated with that is this kind of locally sensed pose that's represented with these vectors here. And then any other features that might be interesting. But But the really key thing is these first two, and that is going to be the core basis of the representation that's being developed, not these kind of more, I'd say, kind of model-free representations. Yeah. Question, Giacomo? Sorry if I say that wrong, Giacomo.
Yeah. So I was wondering the coordinate frames. I didn't get at the input level how they are coordinates in terms of what is it egocentric or allocentric, and then as they get processed in the system, do they get transformed such that you move to a higher level of abstraction?
Right.
So that's yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, so they are in the columns, they're all object centric. So I guess you could say allocentric. I feel like sometimes that term can be a bit confusing. So I'll say object centric. So it's whatever that column is learning about, is modeling. That is the coordinate system it's representing. And then we assume that when the columns are communicating with one another, there is some sort of shared coordinate system, which could be egocentric. It could be, relative to the robot's body, or it could be allocentric in the sense of an environment. So it could be relative to some kind of important landmark right now, the corner of a screen, whatever it may be. And the way that's actually kind of injected into the system is the sensor modules have a representation of where they are in space. And so when they're communicating to the columns, that's kind of where that information comes from.
Right, right. So you are providing as input the like as the system is looking at a point,
Yeah.
you're providing where that point is relative to like the center of the object. Is that
We don't
how
provide it relative to the center of the object because that's kind of unknown.
right?
We
Yeah, that's
provide it relative to, say, the agent's body.
okay. So it is in that sense egocentric at the input level, no?
Yeah, at the input level, egocentric, yes.
Okay, okay. That was
Yeah.
so the system learns basically to um like to get at these object-centric coordinates.
Yeah,
That
and the way it does that, maybe it'll be clear in a minute, but you can imagine it kind of in its internal coordinate system, it just needs to, the first time it learns something, it just randomly initializes a point where that point is kind of arbitrary. And then as it moves and integrates information, it's going to update where it is in its internal reference frame and then add more information. And then if you now then put that object somewhere completely different in the environment, when it moves on to that object, it will initialize this hypothesis space. And so it's independent of where the object is in the external environment. So it's translation invariant in that
right.
sense. And then as an added complication, but the columns or sorry, the learning modules are also rotating the inputs as they come in based on the hypothesized orientation of the object. This is something we think maybe the thalamus is kind of involved in the kind of cortico-thalamic projections. But then that basically means that you can understand the movement that's happening through space as well as the orientation of what you're seeing, even if it isn't kind of some canonical rotation that you saw the very first time.
Right. Very, very last follow-up.
Yeah, please.
I promise.
Yeah, no worries.
If I had to put it in like intuitive, like psychological terms, does this correspond to like initially having a wrong hypothesis, for example, or a random hypothesis of what the object is and how it is oriented? So like, for example, I'm looking at this patch of surface and it could be like part of an object that's oriented this way or this way, like, and I randomly initialize my hypothesis and then it gradually aligns with the real.
Yes. Yeah. So that's exactly that. That's getting very close to it. And I guess I should say it's not totally random. So it infers based on what would be possible. So if it senses kind of the surface here, like another possible pose might be kind of that the mug is like this and so forth.
Random given the possible.
Right, but you know, I don't know. Let's say it senses this is kind of a flat patch, so it's not going to initialize a hypothesis like this.
Yeah.
But then yeah, through elimination, it kind of reduces those. Yeah.
I see. Thanks.
Great. There was a question that came up briefly. I don't know if that was still. Yeah, Augustine, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. It was I think related to what Giacomo was saying. Sorry if I butchered your name. What do the first couple like iterations of making this hypothesis look like? Because in terms of, do you predefine into how the model chooses that next position?
Right.
You mentioned that there's some possible places it can be and can't be. Is there some, does it know beforehand where it can and cannot be?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Let me, yeah, I'm finally done talking about the cortical messaging protocol. So I think this stuff about explicit reference frames will help answer that and inference. But otherwise I will, yeah, answer that directly. So yeah, I've been talking a lot about reference frames and kind of object representations. Yeah, that just to briefly say that in the brain, clearly these are used for environments. We know that grid cells do this. Basically, the proposal of thousand brains theory, we use this for other objects or all objects really. And this is also, I think, what I mentioned briefly before, that maybe something like grid cells exists in cortical columns. It doesn't necessarily need to be grid cells. The main thing is that we want to encode locations uniquely, like where we are in space in this object-centric reference frame, and that there's some ability of path integration so that as a sensor moves, that location representation can be updated. And from an intuitive perspective, without that kind of information, without something like that, a column cannot predict what it's going to see next as it kind of moves throughout the world. And so here, making it a bit more concrete. So this, for Monty, what we use is a explicit 3D Cartesian space, at least right now, where, again, using the kind of notation from the paper. So we have a series of learned models. These are a set of points, and with object ID kind of M. And I'm using the term model here in kind of not in the sense of, oh, I trained my model where it's just this like one system, but more in the sense of a model-based reinforcement learning. Like I learned many different models about the world. And so this model is going to be a set of these kind of tuple points where one component is a location in this 3D space in that object's coordinate system. So this is an internal object-centric coordinate system. There's going to be many of these points learned. And at that point, as you can imagine, the first point is just randomly initialized. It really doesn't matter where it is in that space. And then as movement is integrated, the location will be updated. And then if we decide to kind of lay down more information, there'll be a new point at that location. And whatever is sensed at that point is going to be this local pose. It's going to be that, surface normal is going to be that edge that is associated with that location. And then again, anything else like color and that sort of thing we can also include. And this kind of gets to the sort of local associative learning rules that I was also talking about, in that in this first version of Monty, this association is instantaneous. It's a kind of one-shot binding that happens when the kind of internal location is at a particular location and we are sensing something. In newer versions of Monty, it's even more kind of Hebbian in the sense that you kind of gradually build evidence or kind of strength for this kind of association. But the point is, there's it's all local. It's just based on, what is the active representation of where I am in space right now and what am I sensing? And then I'm going to associate those. And then I think inference will then give the last kind of equation that I think will answer a few of the questions that came up, but otherwise I'm happy to clarify things. So just to then make the learning a bit more kind of visual, so Monty will generally have multiple encounters with an object, and any given encounter, it will kind of move over the object, update its model, and then in the next encounter, it will update that again. And so for our distant agent, again in the kind of first version, we have this what we call the naive scan policy, which is a very kind of dense sampling of a particular view that the system gets, whereas the surface agent is just kind of moving all over the surface. But over time, they both build these kind of representations. And I should note that, again, in this first version of Monty, we do have some amount of supervision. We are telling the system, this is the object you're seeing, this is the label, and this is its current pose. And that helps it transform the kind of information it's learned in different encounters into the same space. But we do actually have an unsupervised version as well that we're kind of continuing to work on, where it first figures out what is essentially the kind of information that I recognize. It might just be a small part of the object, but what is the information I recognize from a previous exposure, and then integrates the kind of new information that it's developing. Yeah, Michelle.
I'm gonna backtrack a bit to the last slide or the slide before that when you mentioned like the modules and then like you were like, oh, maybe grid cells, and I didn't quite follow on the next slide. Were you saying that you're including multiple modules on that next like?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, modules here is maybe a confusing term. So as in this is referring to like grid cell modules,
Yeah.
as in yeah. So in I guess yeah, in entorhinal cortex, that's key to kind of having this unique location representation. We don't know how it would be represented in a cortical column, but it would need to be more parsimonious than what is necessary for entorhinal cortex. But
So
yeah,
you're not
I think
necessarily doing like having multiple modules that like have different scales, because that's what's seen in entorhinal cortex where you have like
yeah,
modules
I
of
mean
different receptor
that would
field
work,
sizes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That would work. I guess it's just a question of would that it wouldn't, that full version at least probably wouldn't fit in a single cortical column, but we've thought about maybe some sort of more kind of like 1D representations, but that does have challenges around path integration, or maybe even a more temporal code might be doing kind of something to kind of capture this location information in a way that it's kind of a unique fingerprint for I'm at this location in this object reference frame, and then also being able to update that with movement.
Yeah, because and then sorry, I'll stop interrupting, but
No, sorry.
there's really amazing work out of the Feet Lab in January. I don't know if maybe
I don't know if I know that particular one. Yeah.
it's a Nature paper that's really cool where of course they're not doing it in this like these artificial networks, but in like a Hopfield-esque, I mean, Elifeet's like a tractor network that they have very
Yeah.
simply structuring the weight matrix that they have just got them discrete modules. Like they just pop out. And the fact that they didn't have to do anything fancy, it just like a very even general form that just
Yeah.
ended up relying on the size of the connectivity of inhibition, really. And
Okay,
just
interesting.
saying that as how strong, how far inhibitory connections reach, meant that as you decrease that scale, modules just pop out. I don't know how
Interesting.
that would
Yeah.
fit within your
Yeah,
framework,
yeah. No, that's
but
cool. Thank you.
in that sense, it was just like one parameter gave them modules. It's really amazing
Yeah.
work.
Cool. No, yeah, thanks for highlighting that. Written down, yeah, a couple of these now. Also the earlier one Hattie mentioned. Cool. And then yeah, in terms of yeah, so then that was learning, and then so inference. So now we have this model, and now we want to do inference, and again we're going to be moving over it and integrating these kind of small sensory patches, or the information we're receiving from small sensory patches. And so this is showing this kind of hypothesis space being initialized and updated. So on the left, you have the actual kind of object that's being observed, this mug, and where we are at a given step in the episode. And so again, this just showing it's a small patch. And then on the right, you have the evidence for where the object may be. And so you can see already, just from simple low-level cues like color and curvature, maybe the learning module has a bit more evidence. I should say, sorry, these are different models that it's learned. So for a mug, a bowl, golf ball, but it's learned this for 77 different objects. Yeah, but it may have a bit more evidence for certain parts of this mug, but the bowl is also red and kind of is reasonably likely. But the key thing is as it moves, the kind of all the different hypotheses like locations are going to be updated by movement. As I kind of alluded to earlier, an extra complication is it actually transforms these movements by the hypothesized orientation of the object. And then as it kind of gets updated, it gets matched to kind of, or attempted to be matched to the sensory information coming in. And then basically as a function of, the prediction error, the evidence is what we call this kind of accumulation is going to be incremented or decremented. And eventually, after, exploring for a bit more and coming to kind of quite a distinct part of the object like the handle, it's quite confident about where it is. And so this relates to, some of you may be familiar with particle filters and how they're used for localization, for example, in robotics. So a lot of kind of the kind of core concept here has overlap with that. But this just kind of then shows that again with this notation where, so we're going to have multiple learning modules, and any one of those is going to have a set of its hypotheses indexed with K, and these are going to change over time. And then a kind of given hypothesis, again, is like a tuple in this space that has sorry, I can't speak, hypothesized ID associated with it. So for example, a mug, it has a pose, but this time it's the pose of the object as a whole. So this is the pose, the hypothesized pose of, for example, the mug in body-centric coordinates. And this is that information that's going to be passed up the hierarchy if the learning module becomes confident about what it's seen. But it's also this is the pose that is transforming incoming input in order to put it into the correct coordinate system, basically. And then we have the kind of location that's in of where the hypothesis is in the location, in the reference frame. And then we have the evidence value associated with it, essentially the confidence kind of that hypothesis. And this location, it's important to emphasize, is both of these are a function of time. So as we move, that movement vector that's coming in is going to be transformed by our hypothesized rotation, and then that's going to update this location of where we think we are. And then the evidence value is what's going to then be kind of accumulated over time. And you can think of kind of an increase in evidence as the inverse of prediction error. So this figure here is showing evidence as a function of the steps of the episode. And as Monty is kind of exploring this object, it's building evidence for these the spoon, fork, and knife, because it's moving along the handle. They all look quite similar. And then at this point is when, through that goal state, it decides to move to the head of the spoon. And then it decides, okay, or basically the observations it's getting are now inconsistent with the fork and the knife. And that prediction error means that the evidence for those begins to decrease or diverge.
Do you have a fixed set of hypotheses, or do they also?
Yeah. So the set of hypotheses are basically initialized such that whatever the local pose that's observed, what is so that's kind of the sensory, that local pose coming in the center. What is the global transform that would need to that the object would need to have right now to make kind of that compatible with that local observation? And so what that means in practice is kind of when you get the first sensory observation, you get for every learned point in the model, there's probably going to be at least two hypotheses initialized for that point. And then, but depending on kind of if it's like an umbilical point where there's no principal curvature directions, we kind of sample multiple points, kind of 8 points along a sort of radial kind of plane. But yeah, I guess to say that that's and then those hypotheses are fixed. They can be updated over time in terms of their location and their evidence, and they can drop so low in evidence that we stop kind of updating them, but they're otherwise fixed. That's the kind of original version of Monty that if I that I'll show results of later. The now Monty is able to kind of add new hypotheses as it goes. And so that's already definitely an improvement. The other thing is in this version we kind of naively it's a fairly uniformal kind of initialization. It doesn't have any bias, for example, that I tend to view I tend to see mugs right side up. So let me start with that hypothesis. And so it's worth kind of pointing out here we're dealing with computers. We're initializing hundreds or thousands of hypotheses at once. If this is happening in the brain, it's more kind of doing, I don't know, a dozen hypotheses, and maybe there's some way that it can kind of serially test those and update those. But it's not going to do this many. And so, yeah, we definitely want to start bringing in priors over kind of just from what the object has seen, what are common orientations, what are common scales as well, because that's another question. But we also, want to, I can't remember. There's basically a lot of work that we're doing right now to kind of make this a bit more intelligent. But
that makes sense. I mean, the reason I ask is because I've been thinking about these online inference where your prior evolves over time. I've been thinking about it a lot recently. That's why it came to my mind. So I think that would be a very interesting thing to add.
Right. And yeah, no, that's I agree. And it could definitely change over time as kind of, even just with like a simple counter or something like that, based on certain poses. And I think there's some interesting evidence of how humans are faster at recognizing objects in more typical poses. And then in terms of the poses that we find most difficult, what's interesting is kind of it's, for example, like right side up for something, find something that's kind of more characteristic that also isn't going to pour everywhere. Right side up, we do, really fast. A few kind of degrees from here, we do pretty quickly. And actually upside down, okay, it is leaking. Upside down, we do what you call it? Okay, it's actually at kind of 135 degrees, like this awkward angle that's not quite upside down, but like slightly off from that. That's where we're slowest. So it does have this kind of flavor of, whether it's serial or whatever, kind of some sort of sampling of this kind of distribution of likely poses. And then, just to say that I kind of mentioned earlier how we want our system to be a bit like, a neuron, have some kind of concept of integrating information, and that point is associated, it kind of represents something, even if it's more of a distributed way. And so one thing you can kind of think about is how the evidence accumulation is a bit like the membrane potential of a neuron. And so this is an example from a more recent version of Monty. This is, to your question, Hadi, this is one where we initialize hypotheses at kind of all the time, or actually we're trying to do it as a function of prediction error. And so initially it's shown a strawberry, and so evidence for that accumulates over time, but then that object is swapped. And so now it's looking at a banana, and then you see that decay, and then the evidence for a banana grow. And so the kind of main thing that we're missing here is, a spiking threshold. And that's largely because we haven't had a need for it so far. But it's interesting to think about how, as we get into more unsupervised learning, that might actually be something that's quite useful to add into the system. Sorry, I think it was Augustine. Did that help kind of what I discussed here? Feel free otherwise to ask that question again.
Yeah, no, I think it was interesting. I was also, I think, also the mention about the supervised versus unsupervised learning. How how do those models compare then? Because you mentioned now you've got a couple more recent versions of Monty where you do start it with an unsupervised hypothesis, and is the performance noticeably worse, or is it getting, yeah,
Yeah,
how does it
so
differ?
right. So right now in the very first like unsupervised one, it was able to try and stitch these models together. And sometimes it works, but the problem is, you know, it it's at a certain level, it's maybe a feature and not just not always a bug. But basically, if the morphology of the objects is similar, it was likely to stitch them together. So that's not particularly compatible with doing well on YCB because it doesn't want you to think these objects are the same thing. Um, but to, a human, maybe at a certain level, an apple and a peach or whatever it may be, or these different kind of cardboard boxes, there is some kind of similarity. Um, but but then what we've implemented, but just haven't had a chance to kind of really kind of play with, kind of evaluate and things like that, is one where we kind of keep a bit more of like a counter of, okay, at this location in my reference frame, I saw this feature. I'm kind of accumulating that, and that might be something happening at a kind of synaptic level in a neuron. But anyways, those kind of counts are kind of accumulated in this space, and then we enforce that there's a certain amount of sparsity. So and so the system kind of, it cannot remember everything, and it also doesn't want to remember everything it's ever seen. It's just going to kind of focus on what were the most salient things. And I think once we actually have a chance to play around with that, that should help with a lot of this like false conjunction where it kind of fuses these mugs together and things like that. Because at a certain level, that's not wrong. We just want it to, if it is going to fuse these together, kind of build a model that's smooth and so forth. And then as a separate thing, then we need to have appropriate benchmarks where, as long as it's getting the right object, that isn't necessarily wrong, even if it doesn't satisfy the kind of label that might be in the data set. That also reminds me, kind of one of the other things we're working on a lot is ways that these models would be much sparser. So again, we don't think the brain has these thousands of points and this very dense point cloud. One of the ways this differs, a lot from a particle filter is this idea of modularity, that it's not just one level and, everything is represented at that one level. All these learning modules are kind of responsible for learning different parts of the world. And so that should enable us to, have a learning module that understands the concept of a handle or whatever and can pass that kind of information up. Um, and but then also kind of policies and how that kind of plays in, because the distant agent right now is doing something a bit like a random walk. It's not very efficient unless it does these goal-directed ones. But if we kind of saccade to the salient points, then it can kind of focus on representing those in the model rather than trying to remember everything.
There's another question here.
Hey,
Yeah.
Theo, I'm a PhD student in EECS, and I'm interested in your comparison to particle filters. I'm not totally understanding how this is kind of a fair comparison. I guess the typically particle filters are typically implemented in a parallel fashion where each of these are passing messages to maybe their neighbors, and they maybe have something executing with respect to a local feature that's then being aggregated globally. So I don't understand what you're saying about how it's distinct.
So I guess I mean as in the different learning modules. So if a particle filter was used to represent, for example, what object you're on, then firstly, at least to my knowledge, there's a paper in 2011 and in 2014, both robotics papers that kind of tried to use something like a particle filter or try to use a particle filter to do kind of object recognition, but in general hasn't been explored much. But that's going to kind of represent where you are in the space of the mug. But in a thousand brain system, the idea is that we're not just interested in one cortical column or one learning module representing where you are on a mug. We're also interested in the hierarchical representation of, what is the object that might be part of that mug, and what is the kind of environment or other object that that mug is part of. And so that hierarchy and every component in that hierarchy that might exist out in the world has its own reference frame that's being used to represent it. And so the closest thing I know to that I'm aware of in kind of robotics is Andrew Davison. Actually, yeah, this was something I wanted to talk about, but I wasn't sure if I'd had time. But Andrew Davison at Imperial, and he leads the robotics at Dyson. He's discussed this idea in the last, I think around since 2018, of kind of sort of universal SLAM, that SLAM should be used for much more than just environments. And actually, I think that has a lot of interesting parallels to the Thousand Brains theory, that what we want is to use maps, that is the kind of the useful way to represent structures in the world.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I just think maybe the comparison isn't like I guess particle filters, at least in the robotics community, are not seen as like models for object recognition or that kind of thing, as much as like a kind of generic catch-all Bayesian optimization scheme.
Yeah.
So I guess the comparison in contrast to a particle filter didn't make a lot of sense to me, but now I understand the distinction in terms of just different goals.
Right. Yeah. Okay, nice. But yeah, what I was going to say was kind of interesting about that is, so SLAM kind of originally emerged in robotics as a way of understanding where a robot is in an environment, and then it seems that the last few years robotics is kind of moving towards this idea of, okay, maybe SLAM could be used to represent kind of other things, potentially everything. And maybe evolution did something similar, where the most important thing that an animal needs to be able to represent first is where it is in an environment and be able to remember that. And so that's what the kind of hippocampal complex evolved for, as well as memory and so forth. But then at some point, evolution kind of figured out maybe maps are a good way of representing other things, and that this is a more kind of general representational format. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that there's potentially this kind of parallel in both robotics engineering and evolution. So let's see, how am I doing for time? Okay, so I've talked about then how Monty works. I don't know if there's any more questions about that, but otherwise now I was going to talk about some of the results from our paper about its capabilities. I also appreciate, Hadi, I probably past the first hour. I don't know if you have a preference for.
Yeah. No, I mean, so I guess we're trying. Yeah, we should try to conclude, let's say, by 11. So like 20 more minutes, and if you have like 5 minutes for the final Q&A, I think that could work.
Okay, perfect. So then, as I talked about before, we're dealing with YCB for the results that I'm going to show now, and we're focusing on representation learning in particular. These 3D objects. And so for the kind of first experiments I'll show, we train Monty by showing these kind of 14, what we just identified as sort of canonical rotations. It just corresponds to, you can imagine, kind of the sixth side of a dice or a cube, and then the corners kind of looking down on that. And we show Monty these different rotations once from all these different poses, and then it has its models. And then to then look at kind of robustness. So what we're interested in here is this idea that these kind of structured reference frames might provide a degree of robustness to perturbations through the use of this kind of structured representation. And so the kind of simplest evaluation is just where we show the same kind of 77 objects, but with a different initialization, such that the exact sensory path that the Monty follows is different. unsurprisingly, the accuracy on the left in blue, and then the rotation error of what Monty thinks the pose of the object is are both low. And then we kind of started introducing perturbations in the form of noise. So this included noise applied to the locations, such that where Monty kind of thinks it is in terms of that information from the sensor module is noisy, but also things like the curvature, magnitude, and the color associated with a point. And then increase that further to then add new rotations. And so I should say these are entirely novel rotations that Monty hasn't seen. And when Monty's doing inference, the way it initializes based on that kind of what is the pose that would be compatible with what I'm observing, it isn't kind of sampling from a fixed distribution of poses it has seen before, if that makes sense. So it can kind of truly kind of interpolate to kind of novel rotations. But then the kind of last thing is then adding in an entirely new color. And here, we basically set all of the observations that Monty's getting to this kind of intense blue, so that it lost any information about that. And in general, what we see is that although accuracy does come down somewhat, it's still able to do reasonably well on a task with 77 objects. Oh, sorry. And so the argument is that by using these kind of structured representations where it's only by kind of moving over the object, with this very small sensory patch, but integrating that movement, it's going to be very sensitive to the global structure, but comparatively insensitive to these other factors like noise in a given observation, or kind of completely changing the color. But then we wanted to kind of probe this a bit more in terms of this use of kind of structured representations. And one way we did that was looking at the evidence values that accumulate for objects. So this is the figure I've shown a few times, where you see as Monty's sensing the spoon, that's the actual object it's sensing, but it also accumulates a reasonable amount of evidence for the fork and knife. And we can do that where we show many different objects and we essentially cluster them based on kind of differences in this evidence space, distances in this evidence space. And what we observe here is that, when Monty's sensing a knife, it has similar evidence values for morphologically similar objects like the fork and spoon, and similarly for these box-like objects and these kind of cup objects. And this is, despite learning on a very tiny data set. It's 77 objects viewed in these 14 rotations once. That's all the training data that Monty gets. So that suggests that Monty does seem to be developing these kind of globally structured representations, and that could underlie this tolerance to noise. But I think one thing that's worth kind of highlighting is that we don't want representations just to be kind of invariant. They should also be appropriately equivariant. And so what I mean by that is, we want the object ID as the rotation changes generally to be invariant, to not change. But as the object rotates, we want the internal rotation that Monty has kind of hypothesized about that object to appropriately change as well. But it's a bit more complex because there's also symmetry in the world. And in particular, we want to treat symmetric rotations as similar. And this is something that fortunately Monty does naturally, because when it has a hypothesis about, or kind of a set of hypotheses about the object rotation, as it moves over the object, if these poses are symmetric, and it's difficult to define kind of symmetry. It's something that humans naturally notice and kind of understand, but it's part of the inherent challenge of kind of putting it in a machine learning system. But if Monty is kind of moving over these objects and essentially is unable to distinguish these hypothesized poses, then it eventually declares, I think these are symmetric. Whereas a hypothesized pose that is inconsistent with the observations it's seen, that's associated with a high prediction error, it's not going to be part of this set of symmetric poses.
Just to clarify, Monty right now only explores does active sensing. It doesn't grab the object and rotate it, move it around.
Correct. Yeah. It cannot at the moment kind of manipulate the object. It just as you say, it moves the sensors.
Okay, makes sense.
And we can kind of check this more quantitatively by using the chamfer distance, which is a metric for looking at the distance between two sets of point clouds, where essentially if those point clouds overlap very closely, there's a low chamfer distance, where it'll be high if they differ a lot. And it's essentially a kind of sum over Euclidean distances. Then kind of looking at that, at this with Monty, so these are those three different rotations I was showing before. We have just kind of a naive measure of rotation error in blue on the left, and then we have the chamfer distance on the right. And then this is the ground truth pose. And so these three poses, which Monty believes are similar, you can see not all of these, if we look at rotation error as a kind of geodesic difference, many of these are associated with high rotation error. But Monty has kind of picked up on the fact that there's this symmetry, and that's what's reflected then in this low chamfer distance. Whereas random rotation that Monty does not think is symmetric with any of these also does have a high chamfer distance. And in the paper, we kind of quantify this at a more kind of across many samples. We don't just want our system to be robust, we also want it to act quickly and infer rapidly. And one of the ways that Monty does this is through more intelligent action policies. And so this is one that I've talked about a few times now, this kind of model-free policy that uses the sensed kind of surface and curvature to kind of guide itself along particular kind of areas of high principal curvature. This was something that as early as Gibson noticed that humans tended to do when feeling those objects I showed at the start. But then the more kind of interesting one maybe is this hypothesis testing policy, which I briefly described, where we have this, this is the object that's actually being sensed, a spoon, and this is the path of Monty as it moves over it. And when it reaches that point, its hypotheses, the two most likely hypotheses it has is for the spoon and the fork. And this is showing the rotations that it believes that are most likely associated with those objects. And what it essentially does is there's maybe different ways the brain might do this, but at least in Monty, it kind of maps these into a common space and then does a comparison looking for the kind of greatest distance between these models. And in this current version of Monty, we do this using Euclidean distance between these points, basically looking for the most distant nearest neighbor. But you could imagine doing this in kind of feature space if you had a hierarchical model where maybe this is represented as head of spoon, the other one's represented as head of fork, and so forth. But anyways, we're going to try and look for what is the point where this biggest distance in the model space exists, and then that becomes the goal state. The learning module outputs that, but it outputs it in this common coordinate system, in the body-centric coordinate system, and basically says, I think we should be sensing there. And then it's the motor system's responsibility to move to that location. And then that's where we saw this kind of divergence in the evidence. And yeah, I'm trying to go quickly. So this is just showing that as we introduce these model-free and model-based policies versus a random walk, we get higher accuracy because we move to features that disambiguate objects, and we also converge more quickly. So this is number of steps before Monty achieves a high confidence state. And unfortunately, I won't have time to talk about voting today, but essentially, a lot of what I've been talking about is just a single learning module looking through almost like a straw. And you can imagine your brain, you can actually see pretty well looking through a straw and recognize objects around you. But it is a very slow process. And so essentially voting is how we believe cortical columns at kind of a similar level of the hierarchy could be communicating with one another to achieve rapid consensus. And the kind of TLDR is as you scale the number of learning modules, even though they're still accounting for spatial information, it's not like a bag of features style algorithm, that the number of steps to converge drops significantly. But then the last thing that I'm hoping to have time for is about kind of how Monty learns quickly and continually. And so here we actually compare to a VIT, a deep learning system, because here it's actually meaningful the amount of kind of the data set sizes that we're dealing with. And the kind of first one is looking at kind of rapid and few shot learning. So here we have different conditions where we present either a single view of the object or multiple rotations, essentially scaling up the number of rotations that are shown for each object. And then after each one of these kind of conditions, we evaluate performance. And what you see here is accuracy on the y-axis as a function of the number of rotations in the training data. And Monty is in blue. And Monty, I talked about, the learning is extremely rapid. It's one shot right now. And so Monty only needs one epoch to learn all the representations it needs for inference. It never needs to revisit kind of these objects multiple times, dozens of times to learn about them. So in terms of classification accuracy, the only network that does kind of comparably is this VIT that's been pre-trained on this one from Google, 14 million images and 21,000 classes from the internet. Of course, this is relatively in distribution. The YCB datasets very much on the internet and also images of household objects. But if we train a VIT from scratch, then despite giving it many more instances of revisiting these objects, we don't see the same rapid learning. And for the one kind of version where we give it the exact same amount of data, unsurprisingly, that's nowhere near enough to kind of learn anything meaningful. But if we then look at rotation error, which is more out of distribution even for the kind of pre-trained VIT, then we see a bigger gap in terms of as we increase the number of rotations in the training data, the rotation error comes down. But one thing I just wanted to kind of highlight with this rapid generalization was after just a single rotation for each object, Monty already gets around 50% accuracy. And just as a kind of reminder, this is on a 77 object data set with multiple random rotations at inference time. And so, well above chance, which I think is about 1.3%. And part of how this is possible is, of course, some views of an object like a golf ball from different angles will show kind of a similar thing. But this transformation of the incoming sensory information and the incoming movements by the hypothesized rotations gives Monty this very strong rotation invariance, such that it can, even if it's only ever been presented this view during learning, it can infer perfectly fine with this other one. And this is also what I was saying about earlier. It's not sampling from a set of kind of rotations, even though it's only seen this rotation before. There's nothing stopping it from inferring that the object could be upside down. And then in terms of continual learning, we did an evaluation where we learn kind of each object in its 14 rotations, and then we're basically going to evaluate on all the objects seen until then. So for example, if you learn on the kind of Lego object and then do inference on Lego, and then learn on the fork, you would then do inference on Lego and fork, and then so forth. So the amount of tasks that the system needs to retain grows as a number of episodes. And this is a very challenging one. This is kind of the most extreme form of continual learning, because in any given learning period, the system only has access to the object that's in front of it. It doesn't have any sort of batch over of kind of accumulating previous objects, and it doesn't have some sleep phase where it can then randomly shuffle them or anything like that. And so it's an extremely challenging setup then for deep learning, because by its very nature, it requires this contrastive information in order to learn meaningful representations. And so what we see is as an accuracy over all the objects that have been observed to that point, unsurprisingly, the VIT performance collapses, whereas Monty, we just see kind of a gradual degradation as there's increased interference between the learned models. And again, I won't have time to talk about the computational efficiency, but as Will said, it's huge, millions of times less flops for training, and also for inference, we get kind of better accuracy as a function of flops. But I think maybe the takeaway from in terms of the kind of capabilities is that what we find encouraging is that we haven't been kind of engineering Monty, to solve continual learning or to develop symmetry. That was never kind of the goal. All of these kind of features really have just kind of dropped out of starting with these ideas about how cortical columns might be working in the brain, building a system that emulates that, and then a lot of these have just kind of appeared as a kind of happy side effect. And I think that's encouraging because any one of these is quite a significant challenge in current machine learning. And so, yeah, if this has piqued your interest, then we'd love to work with anyone who's interested. But yeah, to kind of wrap up, I started with this thing that existing systems for unsupervised sensory motor learning are limited. And that also applies to Monty right now. We still have a lot of work to do and a lot of things we're excited to develop. And I've talked about how the results I showed today are from our supervised model. But also, the world is hierarchical and it's dynamic. And the models I showed so far are just a single level of learning modules, whereas we've started implementing hierarchical learning modules where they can learn about hierarchy in the world, compositionality, and also we have some ideas. This is not yet at the implementation stage, but some ideas about how time evolving, kind of time would evolve in objects and basically kind of behaviors of objects might be represented. And then very last thing is just that we have also been looking at kind of applications. So if you're interested, one of the ones we looked at was medical ultrasound, which is very much a sensorimotor kind of medical imaging modality. And this is a spam can that I scanned, and this is the model that Monty learned. But yeah, if you're interested, we have lots of resources, and I can post these in Slack as well. And otherwise, thanks everyone for your time and interest.
Thank you. Niels, great presentation and really encouraging results. Any questions? There is one here.
Yeah, no, I've been following your guys' work for a couple of years now, and I just want to thank you guys for kind of leading the way in this sort of modular sensory motor prediction era. Because I haven't seen any model that kind of does what you guys are doing. But yeah, I wanted to ask, one of the kind of cornerstones of your or Numenta's HTM system was kind of having factorially many features allocations being you're able to store factorially many within a finite set of kind of neurons or columns. Are you guys doing a similar kind of approach when you're storing features allocations in your point clouds, or is it just a list of...
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, thank you for the kind words. And yeah, to answer your question, so right now everything is very explicit, and one of the reasons we've decided to keep it that way is we realized it just made debugging and understanding the system a lot easier. So there's been various times where we're like, oh, should we actually use something like grid cell modules to represent space? Because then you would, for example, have a fixed representational capacity, but you would kind of then use that capacity as best you can kind of to represent. Whereas here we are, to your point, kind of just we can kind of keep appending more information. And if anyone's concerned, I can talk about why that isn't why we have continual learning or kind of catastrophic forgetting and robustness. But yeah, I think there will eventually come a time when we do want to do something more like that. And we've also talked about kind of at what point we want to use SDRs or for feature representations, sparse distributed representations. But right now it's just it's much easier to debug, and it's much easier to understand the system when it has this kind of simple, explicit kind of representation of dictionaries and point clouds and lists and stuff like that.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, again, great presentation, super interesting stuff. I think I have to run, so hopefully this won't be too long a question or answer. But I'm curious, like, how these sorts of systems could build understandings where there's multiple objects in the world, and at what point it's useful to kind of discriminate between this is an individual blade of grass versus just grass. You know what I mean? And I think that's something that, is challenging even for humans. And so I'm curious what like the approach would be in a kind of coordinate type fashion.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question. Part of it relates to, I was kind of alluding to this newer version that we've developed but not played too much with yet, where it has kind of a fixed representational capacity and it kind of keeps track of kind of what it's seen and then kind of increments evidence, but then sort of pares it down to like what are the most common things it's seen. So I think that's part of it that you can maybe it's easier to represent a whole tree, rather than all the blades of grass, all the leaves on it and things like that. But I think another thing we've talked a lot about is the importance of attention, and that, if you really want to, you can actually learn a really detailed model of things in the world. But the way you do that is by really attending to it. And if you're not attending, then you're going to learn a much simpler model. And if someone learns how to distinguish different species of trees, they're going to see trees in a totally different way from someone who doesn't have that knowledge. But it's still this kind of structured representation. It's not just like they kind of flash an image and they think, oh, that's that tree. So I guess to answer your question, I think it's a mixture of having kind of models that have some constraint on how much they can represent, but also adding in attention, which we don't really have right now, or in kind of a meaningful way, to kind of decide what is the system going to focus on and actually learn about.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good one.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Giacomo.
Yeah, I was curious about how the system would deal with like incomplete input, like input in which like part of the object is missing, for example, because like would there be some kind of I didn't fully understand the sort of message passing procedure, but
yeah, the voting.
Some kind of like either lateral or top-down kind of completion. How would you expect?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it would probably be a mixture of both. It's not the top down is again something where we kind of have an early version implemented, but haven't really kind of had a chance to demonstrate or anything. But yeah, it'd probably be a mixture of both, where the columns can kind of send these lateral votes. As you say, it's kind of a form of message passing, and basically say, I'm sensing this on this object. I think you would probably be sensing at this point on the same object. But then, as you kind of say, hierarchy is also part of this. If you have a representation of kind of, say, like a scene, and that, behind this object, there's another object, then that information can also be passed down and kind of bias the system. But it would be kind of a bias. So you wouldn't start kind of hallucinating, I guess, that you just see that object fully. There would still be this kind of sense of I guess it's not that you're not getting sensory input compatible with the object actually being there, but there's, I guess, a sense that it might be there.
I see.
But yeah, thanks.
I have a question about okay. Yeah, I really I share your sentiment about deep learning, and usually they fail in out of distribution settings, and as we saw in your results, they fail miserably. But there are these other deep learning models that have some structure in them, and it makes them a little more robust. Like, for example, object-centric representations, they have this manual competition, or like this iterative refinement where different slots compete for different objects. I was wondering if you have tested your, if you included those kinds of models in your benchmark, because that would make your results even more impressive if you outperformed those types of deep learning models as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'd have to think more about if I feel like they would perform that difference. So I mean, I feel like if we were evaluating object-centric representations, for example, like are the representations kind of associated with a location in space and stuff, then I agree kind of slot attention would perform better than a vanilla network. But I guess like one of my concerns with slot attention, for example, is that firstly, it's like one level of hierarchy. You have this like deep CNN or whatever network you choose to use, and then you have the slot attention at the top, which I feel is a very, doesn't feel at all like how we represent objects in the world. It's not like there's just one level of objectness, and everything below that is just this kind of mess of features. So I guess that's one of my concerns, and I think there's been some work actually by some of the original authors looking at how it's kind of sensitive to the hyperparameters of how many slots you actually enable the system to have. I mean, I'm not aware of that, for example, helping with something like continual learning or rapid inference, but yeah, I'd be curious to maybe think about that a
I
bit
think
more.
probably for continual learning, probably not. Because if you use backprop to train, that's my reading of the current literature, is that backprop and continual learning just don't go well together. But I guess for other benchmarks, it would only strengthen your results, because it's super impressive. I mean, you save millions in parameters and also in flops by having these inductive biases. So I guess, yeah, I'm just saying, like, if you add that, it would just be
Yeah.
the results.
Thank you. No, appreciate the tip.
Yeah, I have another very important question. I gotta get it out of my system. Where does the name come from? Is it Monty Python related?
So it's yeah, I think there's some debate about whether that's intentional or not, but so I think we'll leave it open to people to decide. But yeah, you may notice the spam can features a lot as well.
Okay. I guess I'm gonna stop recording now.